I went to my wife's office to surprise her with roses for our 40th anniversary, but what I found on her desk was a death sentence for our marriage. Inside a red folder lay a detailed plan to strip away my sanity, steal my ancestral land, and lock me away forever. The betrayal did not break me. It awakened a predator. I am Carlton, 69 years old, and a retired forensic accountant. Before I tell you how I dismantled my family's criminal conspiracy piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth is the most dangerous weapon a man can wield against those who underestimate him. The glass doors of Cynthia's real estate brokerage were unlocked, but the reception area was completely deserted. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the expensive hardwood floors I had paid to install 5 years ago. I stood there in my best tailored suit, holding 24 white roses, listening to the hum of the air conditioning. It was our 40th wedding anniversary. Cynthia had told me she was buried in paperwork and could not leave the office for lunch. I wanted to bring the celebration to her. I walked quietly down the hallway toward her corner office. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, expecting to find her glued to her monitor. The room was empty. Her leather chair was pushed back. A half-empty cup of black coffee sat next to her keyboard. I stepped inside to place the roses on her desk. That was when I saw it. A thick red folder sat dead center on her blotter, sitting wide open, as if she had left in a sudden hurry. The top document bore the seal of a prominent neurological clinic in downtown Atlanta. My name was printed in bold black letters across the header. Patient file. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I do not have a neurologist. I am in perfect health. I set the roses down on a side table and leaned over the desk. My eyes scanned the medical evaluation. The diagnosis jumped off the page and hit me like a physical blow. Stage 2 dementia, severe cognitive decline, unfit to manage financial affairs. The doctor's notes detailed fabricated incidents of me wandering the neighborhood and forgetting my own son's name. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the page. The next document was a draft of a quitclaim deed. It outlined the transfer of my family's ancestral property, 300 acres of prime real estate in rural Georgia, directly into a limited liability company. I looked at the name of the company. It was registered to Megan, my son Xavier's new wife. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. They were planning to have me declared legally incompetent so they could steal the land my grandfather had worked his entire life to secure. I did not panic. I did not scream. Panic is for amateurs. I spent 40 years of my life working as a forensic accountant for the federal government. My entire career was dedicated to dismantling complex financial frauds, tracing hidden assets, and putting white-collar criminals behind bars. I know what a lie looks like on paper. I picked up the medical report and held it up to the light. The signature of the neurologist at the bottom of the page was completely wrong. The pen pressure was entirely uniform, indicating a slow, careful tracing rather than a fluid signature. The clinic stamp was slightly pixelated around the edges. It was a high-quality color photocopy, not an original ink stamp. They had scanned a real document, altered the text, and printed it out on heavy stock paper. I moved to the quitclaim deed. Attached to the back was a sheet of tracing paper with several attempts at forging my signature. Xavier's handwriting was recognizable in the sharp slanted strokes trying to mimic my cursive. My own son was practicing how to steal my legacy. They viewed me as an expiring resource. They thought my age made me an easy target, a blind old fool who would quietly fade away while they picked my bones clean. They severely miscalculated. My mind is sharper than it has ever been. My career taught me that every criminal makes a mistake out of greed. I stared at the paper trail of their treason. The sheer audacity of their plan was matched only by their sloppy execution. They had left the murder weapon sitting right on the desk. I pulled my smartphone from my breast pocket. I did not let my hands shake. I activated the camera and turned off the flash. I carefully photographed every single page in the red folder, ensuring the lighting was even and the text was perfectly legible. I took close-up shots of the forged signatures, the fake clinic stamp, and the corporate details of Megan's shell company. I backed up the images immediately to a secure cloud server that Cynthia did not even know existed. Once the upload was complete, I placed the phone back in my pocket. I needed to restore the scene exactly as I had found it. I aligned the edges of the medical report and the quitclaim deed perfectly within the red folder. I adjusted the angle of the folder on the desk so it matched the exact position it was in when I walked into the room. I checked the floor to ensure I had not tracked in any dirt. I looked at the 24 white roses resting on the side table. They were meant to symbolize purity and enduring love. They now looked like a cruel joke. I picked up the bouquet. I could not leave them here. If Cynthia knew I had been in the office, she would realize her careless mistake and destroy the evidence before I could strike back. I walked out of her office and pulled the door shut, leaving it ajar precisely the way I found it. I moved silently down the hallway and out the front doors of the brokerage. I walked 2 blocks down the street to a public park. I shoved the expensive white roses deep into a municipal trash can, burying them beneath discarded coffee cups and greasy food wrappers. I walked to my car, got in, and gripped the steering wheel. I took one long, deep breath to steady my racing heart. The man who had driven to the office to celebrate his marriage was dead. The man driving home was a hunter preparing for a slaughter. I arrived home exactly at 6 o'clock, walking through the front door with a relaxed smile firmly fixed on my face. The house smelled of roasted garlic and expensive wine. Cynthia emerged from the kitchen wearing a pristine apron over her designer dress. She kissed my cheek and poured me a glass of sparkling water. We sat down at the formal dining table. She served me a generous portion of glazed salmon, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she asked about my day. I played the part perfectly. I told her I had spent the afternoon reading in the study and lost track of time. She smiled, reaching across the table to pat my hand gently. Her eyes locked onto mine with a look of deep, rehearsed concern. She said she had been noticing how forgetful I was getting lately. She mentioned the misplaced keys last week and the time I forgot to pay the utility bill. She leaned in closer and squeezed my fingers. She announced that she had taken the liberty of booking me an appointment with a specialist next Tuesday just to make sure my mind was staying sharp. I looked into the eyes of the woman I had slept next to for 40 years. I nodded slowly, thanking her for her devoted care. The game had officially begun. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the cold liquid soothe the sudden dryness in my throat. Cynthia sat across from me, her eyes wide with that perfectly manufactured concern. She had just told me she booked a doctor's appointment because of my recent memory lapses. My hands wanted to reach across the table and flip it over. I wanted to scream that I knew about the forged quit-claim deed and the fake neurological report sitting in her office. I wanted to demand how she could destroy 40 years of marriage for a piece of land in Georgia. Instead, I forced the corners of my mouth to lift into a gentle, appreciative smile. I nodded slowly, deliberately, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction to mimic the posture of an aging, vulnerable man. I told her that she was right, that my memory had been slipping lately and that I was deeply grateful she was looking out for me. She beamed, a look of profound relief washing over her face. She reached out and patted my hand again, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. It was a flawless performance on both sides. I was looking at a total stranger, a predator wearing the face of my wife. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to confront her right then and there, but a forensic accountant knows that you never show your hand until you have absolute proof. The trap was set, and I was going to let her walk right into it. The most dangerous thing you can do to a criminal is let them know they are being investigated. I chose the deadly weapon of silence. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. Xavier and Megan breezed into the house, bringing with them a bottle of cheap wine and an air of unbearable arrogance. My son wore a tailored suit paid for by one of his many failed startup ventures, while Megan wore a designer dress that cost more than her car. They kissed Cynthia's cheek and offered me brief, patronizing smiles. We moved to the living room for pre-dinner drinks. That was when the psychological warfare officially began. I had placed my car keys on the entryway table right next to the stack of evening mail, a habit I had maintained for decades. 10 minutes into our conversation, I stood up to grab a pen from the table. The keys were gone. I asked aloud if anyone had seen them. Xavier immediately exchanged a knowing, tragic look with his mother. He stood up and slowly walked over to the armchair I had been sitting in. He reached under the decorative cushion and pulled out the keys with a dramatic sigh. He held them up, shaking his head. He spoke to me in the slow, loud voice one might use with a confused toddler. He told me I had just stuffed them under the cushion and forgotten about them. He asked if I was feeling okay, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Megan chimed in, taking a sip of her wine and softly suggesting that maybe I should not be driving anymore for my own safety. I watched them closely. I did not argue. I apologized profusely, rubbing my temples as if I were genuinely confused and frightened. But behind my feigned bewilderment, my mind was recording every micro-expression. I noted the way Megan's foot tapped nervously against the floorboard, a classic sign of adrenaline masking deception. I noticed Xavier avoiding direct eye contact when he lied about the keys, staring instead at my chin. They were not just cruel, they were entirely amateurish. They thought they were orchestrating a masterpiece of manipulation, but to a trained investigator, they were leaving a trail of behavioral evidence a mile wide. The gaslighting continued relentlessly throughout the meal. Xavier casually mentioned a conversation we supposedly had yesterday about selling the house to fund my retirement care, a conversation that absolutely never happened. Cynthia chimed in, corroborating his lie with terrifying ease, detailing the imaginary numbers we had discussed. They were building a narrative of my mental decline brick by brick right in front of me. Every bite of food tasted like ash, but I chewed and swallowed, nodding along to their fabricated stories. I played the part of the fading patriarch perfectly. I let them believe they held all the power. I let them think they were the brilliant architects of my demise. They had no idea they were simply digging their own graves. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to use the restroom to wash my hands. I walked down the hall, my posture instantly straightening the moment I was out of their line of sight. The hunched shoulders disappeared, replaced by the rigid spine of a man preparing for war. Earlier that afternoon, right after finding the red folder in Cynthia's office, I had stopped at an electronics store. I purchased a state-of-the-art micro-surveillance camera no larger than a button, equipped with night vision motion sensors and direct streaming to my secure phone. I slipped into my home office and retrieved the tiny device from my pocket. I moved quietly back down the hallway, stopping just outside the living room archway. I could hear them in the dining room. They were loudly discussing Xavier's latest business idea, completely ignoring my absence. I reached up to the tall mahogany bookshelf positioned perfectly near the doorway. It offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the living room, the dining area, and the open kitchen. I carefully wedged the tiny black lens between a thick leather-bound encyclopedia and a decorative bronze clock. I adjusted the angle to ensure the kitchen counter was fully in frame. I pressed the tiny activation button. A microscopic blue light blinked once and vanished into the shadows. The feed was live. I had spent decades tracing phantom money through offshore accounts and shell corporations. I knew exactly how to build a bulletproof case. You do not just catch a criminal in a lie. You document the lie. You record the entire process of the deception. You let them become so comfortable in their arrogance that they perform their crimes out in the open, fully believing they are invisible. I took a deep breath, slumped my shoulders back into my old man posture, and returned to the living room. I spent the rest of the evening enduring their condescending remarks, safe in the knowledge that every word, every fake look of pity, and every calculated lie was now being recorded in high definition. By 10 o'clock, the dishes were cleared, and Xavier and Megan had finally left for the night. I told Cynthia I was exhausted and headed upstairs to the master bedroom. I closed the door, locked it silently, and immediately pulled out my smartphone. I opened the encrypted application and accessed the live feed from the bookshelf camera. The high-definition image filled my screen in crisp detail. I saw Cynthia standing alone in the kitchen, illuminated by the soft glow of the under-cabinet lights. She was preparing our nightly cups of chamomile tea, a ritual we had shared for over 20 years. I watched intently as she checked over her shoulder, ensuring she was entirely alone. She reached into the pocket of her pristine apron and pulled out a small, unmarked plastic bag. She extracted a single white pill. She placed it on the marble counter and used the back of a heavy metal spoon to crush it into a fine powder. She swept the powder directly into my favorite blue ceramic mug. She poured the hot water, stirred it thoroughly until the water turned cloudy, and placed the mug on a silver serving tray. My blood ran completely cold. She was not just trying to steal my ancestral property and lock me in a nursing home. She was actively drugging me to make her lies become a reality. I watched the screen as Cynthia picked up the silver tray and walked out of the kitchen. A few seconds later, my bedroom door creaked open. I quickly turned off my phone screen and slid it under my pillow. She walked in with a soft, affectionate smile, carrying the mug of poison. She handed it to me, whispering that the chamomile would help me sleep deeply through the night. I thanked her, maintaining steady eye contact as I took the warm mug from her hands. I told her I would drink it right after I finished reading the final chapter of my book. She kissed my forehead, her lips cold against my skin, and left the room, pulling the door tightly shut behind her. The moment the latch clicked into place, I threw off the heavy covers. I walked silently across the thick carpet to the large potted ficus plant sitting in the corner of our bedroom. I poured the entire contents of the mug directly into the dark, thirsty soil. I made sure to leave just a few drops at the bottom of the cup for absolute authenticity. I placed the empty mug squarely on my nightstand where she would easily see it. I lay back down in the bed, closed my eyes, and deliberately slowed my breathing. I let my chest rise and fall in a heavy, rhythmic pattern. When Cynthia peeked into the room an hour later, standing motionless in the doorway to check her work, I was playing the role of a heavily sedated, helpless old man to absolute perfection. The next morning, the supposed effects of the drug gave me the perfect excuse to act sluggish and disoriented. Cynthia drove me to the clinic in downtown Atlanta, holding my arm with fake tenderness as we walked into the lobby. Dr. Miller was a smooth-talking man in his late 40s, sporting a forced smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He welcomed us into his polished, high-end office and immediately asked Cynthia to wait outside in the reception area. The moment the heavy oak door closed, I casually reached into my breast pocket and pressed the record button on my digital audio pen. Dr. Miller began the evaluation. It became immediately clear that this was not a legitimate medical exam. It was an aggressive interrogation specifically designed to trap me into sounding incompetent. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, intentionally interrupting me to break my concentration. He asked me to recall a sequence of 5 words he claimed he had told me a few minutes ago, words he had absolutely never spoken. I played along flawlessly. I stumbled over the simple math. I acted highly frustrated and confused. I looked down at the floor, projecting the tragic image of a man whose mind was rapidly slipping away into the darkness. But while my posture was defeated, my eyes were actively scanning every single detail of him in his office. That was when I noticed his left wrist resting on the desk. He was wearing a platinum Patek Philippe watch. A forensic accountant is trained to notice wealth, but more importantly, we are trained to spot the desperate, crumbling illusion of wealth. The edges of his crisp white medical coat were slightly frayed at the cuffs. The soles of his expensive leather shoes were worn completely thin at the edges. A man making a legitimate, stable doctor's salary does not wear a watch worth $100,000 while neglecting basic everyday wardrobe maintenance. He only does that if he is drowning in debt to maintain a fabricated lifestyle. He was living entirely on credit, stretching his finances to the absolute breaking point. Miller finally wrapped up the session, scribbling notes onto his pad with a heavy, dramatic hand. He spoke to me in a sickeningly patronizing tone, telling me not to worry about a thing and that he would discuss a comprehensive long-term care plan directly with my wife. I thanked him with a perfectly trembling voice, stood up slowly, and shuffled my feet as I walked out of the office. I had given him exactly what he wanted, a documented performance of severe cognitive decline. But I walked out of that building with a pristine, high-definition audio recording of a licensed medical professional deliberately administering a fraudulent evaluation to steal an old man's freedom. Cynthia dropped me off at home shortly after claiming she had an urgent client meeting and needed to rush back to her brokerage. The house was completely empty. I dropped the sluggish act the second her car pulled out of the driveway. I walked straight to my secure study on the second floor and locked the heavy wooden door. I booted up my fully encrypted laptop. I did not need a police search warrant to find the truth. The internet leaves a permanent, undeniable financial footprint if you know exactly where to look. I ran Dr. Miller's full legal name through public tax records, property deeds, and civil court filings across 3 different counties. Within 45 minutes, I had completely mapped out his miserable financial existence. The picture was even more pathetic than I had initially suspected. Miller was practically bankrupt. He was drowning in 2 separate massive alimony payments, his private practice was hemorrhaging money, and he had a mountain of maxed-out credit card debt. But the golden thread connecting him directly to my wife was cleverly hidden inside a commercial real estate lease agreement. Miller's lavish clinic space was leased through a corporate property management firm. I traced the shell company back to its primary owner. It was Cynthia. He was currently 6 months behind on his commercial rent, owing her firm nearly $100,000. The arrangement was terrifyingly clear and brutally simple. Cynthia was forgiving his massive financial debt in exchange for a fabricated medical diagnosis that would allow her to seize total legal control of my entire estate. They were openly conspiring to commit systemic medical fraud and aggravated elder abuse. I systematically downloaded the commercial lease agreements, the official default notices, and the state tax liens. I organized every single document into a secure, heavily encrypted folder, right alongside the audio recording from my pen and the high-definition video of Cynthia drugging my tea. The undeniable evidence against them was compounding rapidly by the hour. They were arrogantly handing me the rope to hang them with piece by piece, document by document. I was deep into cross-referencing Cynthia's personal bank statements when a violent, explosive pounding echoed through the silent house. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. I immediately closed my laptop, securing the files, and moved quietly down the darkened stairs. The banging on the heavy oak front door was frantic, entirely lacking the polite rhythm of a normal visitor. It sounded like pure, unadulterated panic. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Xavier and Megan practically fell forward into the hallway. They were both sweating profusely despite the cool night air, their eyes wide with genuine, unfiltered terror. Xavier quickly slammed the front door shut behind him and threw the deadbolt. He grabbed me tightly by the shoulders, his hands shaking violently against my robe. He did not bother with the condescending, arrogant tone he had used at the dinner table the night before. His voice cracked sharply as he spoke. He told me his latest tech business venture had completely collapsed and he had secretly borrowed a massive amount of money from some extremely dangerous people to cover his hidden losses. He looked me dead in the eye, his face pale and slick with sweat, and said they needed exactly $50,000 by tomorrow morning. He gripped my arms tighter and said if they did not get the cash immediately, the men were going to brutally kill them both. Xavier tightened his grip on my arms. His fingers dug deeply into the fabric of my bathrobe. The panic on his face was manufactured to absolute perfection. He panted heavily, blowing the smell of cheap alcohol and cold sweat into the stifling air of the living room. Megan stood right behind him, her hands covering her tear-streaked face. She sobbed continuously, repeating her carefully rehearsed lines. She screamed that the loan sharks already knew our home address. She insisted that they would not hesitate to use brutal violence if they did not receive exactly $50,000 in cash before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Xavier dropped to one knee on the hardwood floor. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes, begging me to save his life. He swore this was the last mistake of his life and that he would work tirelessly to pay back every single cent. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by Megan's dramatic cries and my son's rapid breathing. They were intentionally backing me into the most ruthless psychological corner imaginable. If I refused to help, they would immediately use that as evidence in court. They would claim I was a heartless, senile father completely incapable of recognizing a life-threatening danger to my own flesh and blood. If I immediately wrote a check, they would submit that evidence to the judge instead. They would argue that I was easily manipulated and recklessly spending money due to cognitive decline. They thought they had set an inescapable trap for a weak old man. I looked down at Xavier's face, twisted in feigned terror. Through the eyes of a former forensic accountant, I could read this entire performance as clearly as a balance sheet. There were no loan sharks or underworld gangsters here. No dangerous criminal syndicate lends untraceable money to a serial failed entrepreneur without solid collateral. This was entirely a psychological pressure test orchestrated by Cynthia, Xavier, and Megan. They wanted to push me past my breaking point to see how I would react. They desperately craved that $50,000 to inject into Megan's shell company. Simultaneously, they wanted to turn this transaction into a permanent stain on my financial competency record. I maintained a slow, deliberate breathing pattern. I pretended to be a frail old man trembling from an overwhelming shock. I nodded weakly, raising a hand to my chest as if a heart attack were imminent. I whispered to Xavier that I would never let anyone hurt him. I told him to let go of my arms so I could retrieve my laptop. As I turned to walk up the stairs, my investigator brain immediately switched into attack mode. I was going to give them exactly the amount they requested. However, I would never use a standard checking account. In the professional financial world, money never truly disappears. It only leaves an indelible trail. I decided to use a special escrow account I had secretly established years ago at a private bank. This account was not designed for standard civilian transactions. It was permanently tethered to the active monitoring algorithms of the Federal Bank Secrecy Act. Any funds transferred from this account into a newly formed limited liability company with no clear operational history would be instantly red flagged by artificial intelligence. I knew exactly what Megan would do with this money. Her bottomless greed would blind her. She would never withdraw it as cash. She would wire it straight from her personal account into her corporate shell account. She would do this to wash the origins, hoping to legitimize it as real estate revenue. She had no idea that her foolish action would immediately trigger a suspicious activity report. That report would be encrypted and sent directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the United States Treasury. By accepting this money, they were voluntarily placing their own necks into the federal noose of wire fraud and money laundering. I walked back downstairs carrying my laptop. I intentionally let my hands shake violently as I placed it on the glass coffee table. Megan instantly stopped crying. Her eyes were glued to the glowing screen. Xavier stood closely behind me. He breathed hot air onto my neck, trying to monitor every single keystroke. I logged into the banking portal. I slowly typed in each number. I deliberately entered my password incorrectly once to reinforce the image of a man suffering from severe memory loss. I asked Megan for her routing and account information. She recited the numbers flawlessly without a single hesitation. That proved she had thoroughly memorized them well in advance. I set up an expedited wire transfer for exactly $50,000. I moved the mouse over the final confirmation button. I paused for a second. I looked up at Xavier with the tearful eyes of a father sacrificing everything for his son. I asked him if this money would truly end the danger threatening his life. He nodded enthusiastically. He made empty promises using the most falsely sincere voice he could muster. I clicked the button. The computer screen displayed a successful transaction notification. Almost instantly, the atmosphere in the living room completely shifted. The extreme panic radiating from Xavier and Megan evaporated without a trace. The tears on Megan's face dried in the blink of an eye. She looked down at me. For a brief quarter of a second, I clearly saw a triumphant, contemptuous smirk flash across her lips. She truly believed she had just easily conned a senile old fool out of a small fortune. Xavier patted my shoulder. There was no more begging. There was only the cold detachment of a man who had achieved his filthy goal. They quickly excused themselves. They claimed they had to leave immediately to meet the loan sharks and settle the debt tonight. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. I stood up straight. All the frailty completely vanished from my body. I had just officially planted a financial time bomb directly into Megan's banking framework. A federal audit process would automatically commence by tomorrow morning. I smiled coldly in the darkness. The game had officially crossed the boundary of cheap family deception and entered the realm of federal felonies. I closed my laptop. I prepared to head upstairs to review the hidden camera footage I had recorded at the fraudulent doctor's office. But just as my foot touched the first step of the staircase, the cell phone in my bathrobe pocket suddenly vibrated aggressively. It was not a standard text message. It was a maximum security alert linked directly to the brokerage firm managing my $2 million retirement fund. I quickly unlocked the screen. A bright red notification glared back at me. The system warned of multiple consecutive failed password attempts trying to access and change the beneficiary identity on my central retirement account. The intelligent security firewall had immediately recorded and traced the IP address of the device attempting this cyber attack. I stared intently at the sequence of numbers displayed on the screen. The blood in my veins began to boil. That specific IP address perfectly matched the internet network at Cynthia's real estate office. While Xavier and Megan were acting out their theatrical play to siphon my cash at home, my wife of 40 years was sitting in her office in the dead of night. She was actively trying to break through my digital locks to steal my entire life savings. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared at the glaring red security alert illuminating my dark bedroom. Cynthia was actively trying to breach my Vanguard retirement accounts right this second. I did not hesitate for a single moment. I immediately accessed the maximum security portal using my biometric identification and my encrypted master key. I initiated a total freeze on all outbound financial transfers across every single portfolio under my name. I rotated every security credential, wiped all authorized devices, and enabled a strict biometric-only access protocol. I watched the live access log scroll across my laptop screen in real time. I saw 3 more desperate, frantic attempts originating from her office IP address, followed instantly by a final permanent lockout notification. Her cyber attack had completely failed. She was locked out of my $2 million life savings, left sitting alone in her dark office with absolutely nothing to show for her treacherous efforts. I closed the laptop slowly, a cold and heavy sense of satisfaction settling deeply over me. The war had officially escalated beyond our household walls, and it was now time for me to secure the physical battlefield. The next morning, I packed a small travel bag with deliberate precision. I walked downstairs into the kitchen where Cynthia was aggressively stirring her coffee. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed with dark circles from her failed midnight hacking attempt. I kept my voice soft and slightly trembling. I told her I was taking a short weekend flight to Georgia to visit my grandfather's grave. I played the part of a highly sentimental aging man desperately needing a connection to his past as his mind supposedly slipped away. She barely looked up from her tablet, dismissing my trip with a careless wave of her hand and a fake, tight-lipped smile. 2 hours later, I was seated on a direct flight to Atlanta, leaving the toxic atmosphere of my home far behind. Upon landing, I rented an unmarked black sedan and drove straight to my family's ancestral property located in the rural outskirts of the state. I parked my vehicle half a mile away on a hidden dirt road and walked silently through the dense, familiar woods. As I crested the final grassy hill overlooking the valley, the horrifying reality of their unhinged greed hit me like a physical blow. A massive yellow excavator was aggressively tearing through the rich topsoil, violently uprooting ancient oak trees that had stood proudly on my family's land for over a century. A large commercial construction trailer sat anchored near the property line, bearing the bold logo of a contracting company owned entirely by Megan's older brother. They had not even waited for their fraudulent quitclaim deed to be officially processed by the county clerk. They were so utterly confident in their twisted plan to declare me legally incompetent that they were already preparing my grandfather's sacred land for a massive multi-million-dollar commercial subdivision. I stood perfectly hidden in the thick tree line, watching the heavy machinery desecrate my family heritage. I did not shout in anger. I did not run down the hill to stop them. A forensic accountant does not stop a massive crime in progress if letting the crime continue guarantees a significantly longer federal prison sentence for the perpetrators. I pulled out my secure smartphone and recorded a continuous high-definition video of the illegal construction site. I clearly captured the company logos, the license plates of the commercial trucks, and the faces of the equipment operators tearing up the earth. I secured the video, turned around, and walked back to my car in absolute deadly silence. I drove directly back into the bustling heart of the city to a highly discreet, heavily guarded office building. Howard Kaplan, my personal attorney and oldest confidant, was waiting patiently for me in his private suite. Howard is a legal shark who specializes in aggressive asset protection and corporate warfare. I placed my laptop on his polished mahogany desk and systematically showed him everything. I displayed the high-resolution photos of the forged medical report, the fake quitclaim deed, the damning audio recordings of the corrupt doctor, and the fresh video of the excavators illegally destroying my land. Howard did not say a single word until he had meticulously reviewed every single piece of digital evidence. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of mercy. We immediately activated the ultimate legal weapon. 20 years ago, long before Xavier ever met Megan, I had placed the entire Georgia property into a highly classified, irrevocable trust. I am not the legal owner of that land. The federal trust is the sole proprietor. My signature on any property transfer document is legally meaningless and entirely void. By forging my name and transmitting that fraudulent deed across state lines using electronic networks, they were actively committing federal wire fraud. By moving heavy construction equipment onto protected land they did not own, they were committing felony criminal trespass and severe malicious property destruction. Howard immediately began drafting the federal injunctions and preparing the explosive evidence binders for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the state prosecutor. We were not just going to stop their construction project. We were going to systematically annihilate their entire financial and personal futures. I caught a late evening flight back home, feeling the heavy weight of a loaded legal gun resting securely in my pocket, completely invisible but perfectly primed to fire. I arrived at my house just past 10 o'clock at night. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the quiet hallway. My large leather suitcase, the expensive one I always used for extended vacations, was sitting violently overturned in the dead center of the foyer floor. All of my winter coats, heavy boots, and personal belongings had been carelessly thrown out of the hall closet and scattered across the hardwood. I walked slowly into the living room. Xavier and Megan were sitting comfortably on my couch, completely surrounded by massive cardboard moving boxes and packing tape. Megan looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, triumphant smile, holding a large glass of my most expensive vintage wine. Xavier stood up immediately, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. He looked me dead in the eye and announced that given my rapidly deteriorating mental condition, they had decided it was no longer safe for me to live alone with Cynthia. He told me they were officially moving in tonight. I stood frozen in the center of my living room, staring at my expensive leather suitcase lying violently overturned on the hardwood floor. My winter coats, heavy boots, and personal belongings had been carelessly thrown out of the hall closet and scattered across the beautiful rugs. Xavier stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes full of arrogant defiance. He had just declared that they were moving in permanently because I was supposedly no longer competent to care for myself. A sudden surge of pure, unadulterated rage ignited deep in my chest. I wanted to grab him by the collar, drag him to the front door, and throw him out of my house. I wanted to scream that I knew exactly what he and his treacherous wife were planning. But I immediately forced the anger down, burying it deep beneath a mask of confusion. An explosive argument right now would only serve their pathetic theatrical performance. They were desperately searching for an excuse to call the police, hoping to report that I was becoming erratic and dangerously violent due to my fabricated dementia. I could not hand them that legal weapon. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the exhausted, defeated posture of a broken old man losing his grip on reality. I nodded slowly without saying a single word, quietly bending down to pick up my scattered coats with trembling hands. I carried my belongings back to the closet, pretending to completely surrender to their cruel arrangement. As I turned my back and slowly climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear Megan's victorious giggle echoing from the living room. They thought they had successfully conquered the fortress. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with an apex predator. Their invasive presence instantly turned my peaceful home into a suffocating living hell. The very next morning, Megan began aggressively searching the house under the guise of being a helpful, caring daughter-in-law. She casually ripped open the drawers in my private study, rifling through decades of old tax returns, banking files, and investment portfolios. She claimed she was just helping me clean and organize the overwhelming clutter, speaking to me in that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone she reserved for children. But I knew exactly what she was desperately looking for. She wanted the original physical deed to the Georgia property to complete her fraudulent paperwork and solidify her theft. I watched her tear through my personal history, maintaining my blank, confused stare while internally cataloging every single boundary she crossed. Meanwhile, Xavier took it upon himself to assert physical dominance over the property. He changed all the digital security access codes for the front door, the back patio, and the garage. He deliberately did not give me the new combinations. He used the pathetic excuse that I might wander outside in the middle of the night, get lost, and freeze to death. They were systematically stripping away my most basic human freedoms inside the very home I had paid off decades ago. Cynthia completely ignored the psychological torture happening right in front of her face. She left the house early in the morning and only returned late at night, leaving the young couple completely free to mentally abuse me with their cheap daily games. But their overwhelming arrogance led them to make one fatal, catastrophic mistake. They treated me like a harmless, invisible ghost. Because they genuinely believed my brain was rotting away, they brought all of their corporate business records directly into my home. Xavier began using my home address to register commercial documents for his failing startup. He essentially turned my formal dining room into his temporary corporate headquarters, taking loud conference calls and receiving massive shipments of inventory boxes. He had absolutely no idea that our exclusive gated community had incredibly strict homeowner association rules. The bylaws explicitly and aggressively forbade the operation of any commercial businesses from residential properties, carrying massive financial penalties for any violations. I retreated to my bedroom and pulled out my heavily encrypted forensic laptop. I used a secure virtual private network to ensure my digital footprint remained absolutely anonymous. I drafted a meticulously detailed, highly professional complaint. I attached time-stamped high-definition photographs of Xavier's commercial delivery boxes blocking the public sidewalk. I included clear audio recordings of his loud, profanity-laced corporate conference calls echoing through the open windows. I sent that undeniable evidence directly to the Homeowner Association Board of Directors. I did not need to confront him myself. I weaponized the rigid, unforgiving rules of my own neighborhood to strike the first devastating blow. Exactly 2 days later, my anonymous counterattack landed perfectly. A stern, uncompromising homeowner association inspector knocked aggressively on my front door just after breakfast. He bypassed me completely, demanding to speak directly with Xavier. The inspector immediately handed my son a formal citation for $2,000. He clearly and loudly warned that if Xavier did not remove all illegal commercial operations from the premises within 48 hours, the daily fines would automatically double and the association would initiate immediate legal litigation to seize the property. Xavier panicked completely. His fabricated confident persona shattered in an instant. He started shouting and arguing frantically with the inspector right on the front porch, waving his arms in the air and demanding to know who reported him. Megan heard the loud commotion and ran outside to intervene, her voice shrill and highly defensive. Their attention was entirely focused on the massive financial crisis unfolding outside the front door. This was the exact golden window of opportunity I had been patiently waiting for. I dropped my frail old man posture instantly. I slipped silently out of the hallway and moved rapidly into the guest bedroom they had selfishly taken over. Megan's expensive laptop was sitting wide open on the unmade bed, the screen brightly illuminated and fully unlocked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a tiny pre-programmed USB drive. It contained a piece of custom data extraction malware I had coded myself during my years hunting corporate embezzlers. I plugged it directly into her computer. The malicious software immediately activated in the background without triggering any visual warnings. It silently and rapidly cloned her entire email history, downloaded files, financial spreadsheets, and hidden hard drive directories. I stood completely still, watching the tiny status light blink rapidly, counting the seconds in my head while listening to the argument outside. The entire extraction process took exactly 1 minute and 45 seconds. The second the status bar confirmed a complete data transfer, I pulled the USB drive, automatically wiped the access logs, and slipped out of the room. I was back in the kitchen, slowly pouring a cup of coffee with trembling hands, just seconds before Megan stormed back inside, her face red with absolute fury from the argument outside. I walked slowly back to my locked study, carrying my coffee cup. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, I dropped the act completely. I sat down at my desk and immediately plugged the stolen USB drive into my secure system. I deployed a rapid keyword filtering algorithm, commanding the software to scan the massive volume of stolen data for anything related to the Georgia property. Within seconds, a heavily encrypted email chain appeared on my screen. I cracked the basic password and clicked on the most recent PDF attachment. A fully executed commercial real estate purchase agreement stared back at me. The buyer was a massive, highly aggressive commercial development firm based in Atlanta. The official purchase price was listed clearly at $4.5 million. But the staggering amount of money was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. Sitting proudly on the final page of the contract, right below the transfer of ownership declaration, was my own handwritten signature. It had been flawlessly copied and forged, complete with a fraudulent state notary stamp. They were not just preparing to steal my land in the future. They had already officially sold my family's entire legacy. I stared at the forged signature on the screen, letting the reality of their crime wash over me. The initial wave of shock quickly hardened into an icy, impenetrable resolve. They had actually done it. They had executed a fraudulent commercial real estate contract using my name. This was no longer just a greedy family dispute over an inheritance. This was aggravated identity theft and felony forgery on a multi-million-dollar scale. The fake notary stamp pressed next to my copied signature was the final nail in their legal coffin. They were so blinded by the promise of $4.5 million that they completely ignored the catastrophic legal consequences of their actions. I carefully saved the encrypted file and backed it up to my secure cloud server. I did not feel an ounce of pity for them. They had dug their own graves with their insatiable greed. Now it was time for me to start pushing the dirt back in. My focus shifted from the idiotic children playing at corporate crime to the true mastermind orchestrating this entire nightmare. It was time to deal with my wife. The next morning, Cynthia abruptly escalated her timeline. She realized that the fake medical evaluation was not enough to instantly hand her the legal control she desperately needed to finalize the Georgia land sale. She needed a medical power of attorney signed and witnessed immediately. To manufacture the urgency, she began a calculated, highly public smear campaign against me right in our own front yard. I stood by the living room window and watched her lean over the white picket fence, sobbing hysterically to our longtime neighbor, Mrs. Gable. Cynthia dramatically wiped away fake tears, claiming that I had become aggressive and dangerously unpredictable during the night. She lied through her teeth, telling the neighborhood that she feared for her physical safety and desperately needed the legal authority to place me in a secure memory care facility before I hurt someone. Mrs. Gable patted Cynthia's shoulder sympathetically, completely buying into the tragic performance of the devoted, suffering wife. I turned away from the window, feeling a sickening wave of disgust. Cynthia came back inside an hour later, slamming a thick stack of legal documents onto the kitchen counter. She shoved a pen toward me and demanded I sign the medical power of attorney right then and there. I played the bewildered, frightened old man. I told her my hands were shaking too badly to hold the pen and begged her to let me rest until tomorrow. She rolled her eyes, grabbed the papers, and hissed that I was running out of time. She had no idea how right she was. The moment she left for her brokerage, I returned to my locked study. I had already gathered the evidence of her bribing the corrupt doctor, but I needed to completely destroy her professional foundation. I dove deep into her real estate firm's public financial filings, cross-referencing them with the private banking statements I had secured earlier. It did not take long for a forensic accountant to find the rotting core of her business. Cynthia had been illegally commingling her clients' earnest money deposits with her personal operating accounts to fund her lavish lifestyle and cover Xavier's massive business debts. It is one of the most severe, unforgivable violations a licensed broker can commit. I systematically compiled every manipulated ledger, every illegal wire transfer, and every forged bank reconciliation. I organized the explosive evidence into a highly detailed, undeniable digital dossier. I drafted a formal anonymous complaint outlining exactly how she was defrauding her clients and violating state financial regulations. I attached the mountain of irrefutable proof. I pressed send, routing the encrypted package directly to the primary investigative division of the State Real Estate Commission. The fuse was officially lit. I did not stay at the house to wait for the fallout. I wanted a front row seat to her professional execution. I drove downtown and parked 2 blocks away from Cynthia's high-end real estate brokerage. I walked into a small, unassuming coffee shop situated directly across the street from her office building. I ordered a black coffee, took a seat by the large front window, and simply waited. The State Real Estate Commission does not play games when it receives concrete proof of massive financial commingling. Less than 2 hours later, 3 unmarked black vehicles pulled up aggressively to the curb right in front of her building. 4 severe-looking state investigators stepped out, accompanied by 2 uniformed local police officers. They did not knock politely. They marched straight through the glass front doors with the focused intensity of a tactical strike team. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the chaos unfold through the large pane of glass. Within minutes, I could see panicked employees being ushered out of the building, clutching their personal belongings. Then the investigators began taping official bright orange notices across the inside of the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were formal cease and desist orders suspending the firm's operating license effective immediately. They were locking down the entire premises to seize the servers and secure the physical financial records. Cynthia was trapped inside, completely surrounded by federal and state authorities demanding answers for the massive holes in her escrow accounts. Her pristine, carefully constructed image of a successful, wealthy business owner was being violently ripped to shreds in broad daylight. She was losing her license, her reputation, and her primary source of fraudulent income, all at the exact same time. I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked out of the shop. My work there was done. I walked back to my car with a steady, relaxed stride. I felt an incredible sense of clarity. For decades, Cynthia had used that brokerage to project an aura of superiority and untouchable wealth. She used it to belittle my stable, quiet career as a government employee. Now the very institution she used to feed her massive ego was the exact instrument of her downfall. I drove back to our quiet suburban neighborhood, enjoying the smooth hum of the engine and the bright afternoon sun. I knew exactly what was coming next. A cornered animal is always the most dangerous, and Cynthia had just been backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. I was sitting calmly in the living room chair reading a book when the front door flew open with terrifying force. Cynthia burst into the hallway like a hurricane of absolute panic and rage. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her hair was completely disheveled, and her makeup was smeared across her face. She was practically hyperventilating. She did not even look at me. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently up the stairwell, demanding that Xavier and Megan get downstairs immediately. The 2 of them came rushing down the steps, their faces pale with shock at the sight of her completely unhinged state. Cynthia paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, waving her hands erratically. She screamed that the state had just raided her office, frozen her operating accounts, and suspended her broker's license indefinitely. She looked at her son and her daughter-in-law with wild, desperate eyes. She told them they were completely out of time and out of money. She declared that they could no longer wait for the standard legal process. Tonight was the night they were going to end this permanently and take total control of my life. I did not stay in the living room to entertain her psychotic breakdown. I quietly slipped away while they were busy panicking and locked myself inside my upstairs study. I did not turn on a single light. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint cold glow of my laptop screen casting long shadows against the walls. I reached into the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk, pulled out a pair of professional-grade noise-canceling headphones, and plugged them directly into my secure audio port. I opened the encrypted surveillance application and tapped into the hidden microcamera I had planted in the kitchen earlier that week. The high-definition video feed buffered for a split second before displaying the three of them gathered around the massive marble island. They looked exactly like a syndicate of cornered rats frantically searching for a way out of a sinking ship. The audio transmission was incredibly crisp and clear. I could hear Cynthia's ragged, uneven breathing as she poured herself a massive glass of scotch. Her hands were shaking so violently that the heavy crystal decanter repeatedly clinked against the rim of her glass, spilling amber liquid across the pristine countertop. Xavier and Megan stood on the opposite side of the island, their faces pale and drawn tight with severe anxiety. I sat back in my leather chair, perfectly hidden in the secure shadows of my own home, and listened to my own family actively plot my ultimate destruction. Cynthia slammed her empty glass onto the counter with a loud crack. She did not even bother whispering. She told them the state financial investigators had completely locked down her brokerage, seized all physical files, and frozen every single operating account under her name. She admitted out loud that she had been illegally borrowing client earnest money funds to float Xavier's continuously failing businesses, and now the state had absolute, irrefutable proof of her massive embezzlement. Megan gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth in genuine shock. Xavier paced the kitchen floor like a caged animal, furiously running his hands over his head. He demanded to know what they were going to do to avoid federal prison. Cynthia looked at him with a gaze so cold and entirely devoid of maternal warmth that it sent a brief chill down my spine. She stated firmly that there was only one way out of this massive financial crater. They needed immediate, unrestricted access to my $2 million retirement portfolio and the absolute legal authority to finalize the sale of the Georgia property by the end of the week. Megan stammered aggressively, pointing out that the commercial real estate firm in Atlanta was demanding the original deed and a physically verified signature before they would ever release the $4.5 million. Cynthia leaned heavily against the marble island, her eyes darting back and forth. She lowered her voice to a venomous, sharp whisper. She declared that they were no longer going to wait for the slow standard legal process to declare me incompetent. She said I had become a massive liability and that my continued presence in the house was a ticking time bomb they could no longer control. Tomorrow morning, the very second the county courthouse opened, she was going to file an aggressive petition for emergency medical guardianship. Xavier stopped pacing abruptly. He asked how they could possibly get a strict judge to grant an emergency order without a thorough state-mandated medical evaluation. Cynthia smiled. It was a terrifying, crooked expression of pure, unadulterated malice. She reminded them of the fraudulent medical report she had already purchased from Dr. Miller, but she admitted she needed something much more immediate, something highly explosive to force the judge's hand right away. She looked directly at her son and her daughter-in-law, her eyes completely dead. She told them they were going to create a violent domestic crisis tonight. She planned to manufacture a brutal physical altercation, call the police immediately, and have me forcibly removed from the property under a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold. Once I was locked inside a state mental ward, heavily medicated and completely isolated from the outside world, she would have absolute uncontested control over my entire life and every single penny I had ever earned. I listened to them finalize the horrific details of my forced institutionalization. They were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. They were discussing my permanent confinement as casually as one might discuss taking out the weekly garbage. I calmly removed my headphones and placed them gently on the wooden desk. My heart rate remained exceptionally slow and steady. A weaker man might have completely crumbled under the psychological weight of such profound betrayal from his own flesh and blood. But I am a forensic accountant. I have spent my entire adult life thriving in the cold, hard reality of undeniable facts and documented evidence. I opened the encrypted master folder on my desktop and began the final methodical review of my legal arsenal. I systematically checked the high-definition video of Cynthia crushing the heavy sedative into my evening tea. I verified the pristine audio recording of Dr. Miller conducting his entirely fraudulent, manipulated medical evaluation while wearing a watch he could not afford. I reviewed the downloaded commercial lease agreements definitively proving the financial extortion occurring between my wife and the corrupt physician. I opened the digital file containing the fake quitclaim deed bearing my poorly forged signature right alongside the damning data extraction from Megan's computer proving federal wire fraud. Finally, I opened the digital copy of the irrevocable trust documents provided by my aggressive attorney, Howard Kaplan. The federal paperwork definitively proved that I did not even legally own the Georgia property they were so desperately trying to steal. I compiled every single piece of evidence into a chronologically organized, highly secure digital binder. I sent a duplicated, heavily encrypted copy directly to Howard's private server with a prearranged authorization code. The trap was now fully constructed, armed, and ready to snap shut with bone-crushing force. I had given them every conceivable opportunity to walk away from this madness, but their bottomless greed had pushed them far past the point of no return. I closed my laptop, plunging the study back into complete silent darkness. I stood up from my desk and stretched my legs slowly. It was time for me to go downstairs and play my designated role in their little theatrical production. I unlocked my study door and stepped quietly into the hallway. I expected to hear them moving around downstairs, carefully setting the stage for their manufactured crisis. I walked slowly down the stairs, heading straight for the kitchen to get a glass of water and wait for their opening move. I had barely reached the bottom step of the staircase when the heavy oak front door was suddenly thrown open with incredible violence. I expected to see Cynthia standing there ready to initiate her fabricated argument and fake an injury. Instead, a blinding array of red and blue emergency lights violently illuminated the dark foyer through the large front windows. The deafening, piercing wail of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet suburban night, shutting off abruptly as heavy vehicles aggressively boxed in our concrete driveway. I stood completely frozen at the base of the stairs. I had miscalculated her desperate timeline. She had not waited for me to come downstairs to start an argument. She had already executed the final phase of her plan while I was reviewing the files. 2 heavy police patrol vehicles were parked horizontally across my front lawn, their high beams shining directly into my house. Cynthia came sprinting out of the kitchen, her blouse intentionally torn at the collar and her face bearing fresh, self-inflicted scratch marks. She charged straight past me and threw herself out the open front door. She collapsed dramatically onto the concrete front porch, sobbing hysterically into the cool night air. She pointed a violently trembling finger back into the dimly lit house, screaming at the top of her lungs to the approaching armed officers. She yelled that her husband had completely lost his mind, that I was currently holding a massive meat cleaver, and that I was threatening to butcher the entire family in cold blood. The heavy oak front door did not just open. It was violently kicked inward, the deadbolt shattering wood as it gave way to brute force. 3 police officers surged into my foyer with their service weapons drawn and tactical flashlights blinding my vision. They moved with the aggressive, adrenaline-fueled precision of a tactical unit responding to a violent hostage situation. Laser sights danced wildly across the walls before settling directly on my chest. They screamed commands, their voices overlapping in a chaotic wave of absolute authority. They ordered me to freeze, to drop the weapon, and to put my hands immediately in the air. I did not panic. I did not make a single sudden movement. My forensic training had conditioned me to remain entirely analytical in the face of extreme pressure. I stood perfectly still behind the large marble kitchen island. I was not holding a meat cleaver. I was holding a small silver paring knife in my right hand and a crisp green apple in my left. I had walked into the kitchen just seconds before Cynthia launched her insane theatrical performance. I looked at the 3 armed officers aiming their weapons at my heart. I slowly, deliberately placed the paring knife flat on the marble countertop. I placed the apple right next to it. I raised both of my hands high above my head, keeping my fingers spread wide and completely visible to prove I was unarmed. The lead officer, a tall, heavily built man with a tight jaw, kept his weapon leveled at my center mass while he slowly advanced into the kitchen. He kicked the small paring knife out of my reach, the metal clattering loudly across the hardwood floor. He demanded to know if there was anyone else in the house. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not stutter. I did not tremble. I dropped the frail, confused old man persona entirely. I spoke with the crisp, authoritative, and deeply calm voice of a man who spent 40 years working alongside federal agents. I told him my son and daughter-in-law were currently upstairs, likely hiding in the guest bedroom. I assured him that the house was entirely secure and that absolutely no one was in any physical danger. The officer frowned, clearly confused by the massive disconnect between Cynthia's hysterical claims of a deranged knife-wielding lunatic and the perfectly composed, highly articulate senior citizen standing before him. He ordered me to turn around and place my hands flat against the wall. I complied instantly and without a single word of protest. I let him pat me down for hidden weapons. Once he stepped back, I slowly turned my head to look at him. I told him I completely understood why they had breached my door with such aggression. I stated clearly that my wife had just fabricated a violent domestic incident because she was currently experiencing a massive psychological breakdown. I explained that her real estate brokerage had been raided and completely shut down by state financial investigators earlier that very afternoon for severe corporate embezzlement. I told the officer she was desperately trying to manufacture a crisis to seize control of my personal assets before she went to state prison. The officer stared at me, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Police officers are highly trained human lie detectors. They know the distinct difference between genuine chaotic panic and calculated cold truth. But he needed undeniable physical proof before he could lower his weapon. I lowered my right hand slowly and pointed a single finger toward the tall mahogany bookshelf standing in the corner of the adjacent living room. I told him there was a micro-surveillance camera hidden exactly between the heavy encyclopedia and the bronze clock. I told him it was recording in high-definition audio and video and that it had captured everything that happened in this room over the last 30 minutes. The lead officer signaled to his partner, who quickly moved to the bookshelf and located the tiny black lens. I slowly reached into my robe pocket using only 2 fingers to show I was not reaching for a weapon and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure surveillance application. I placed the phone flat on the marble counter and pushed it gently toward the lead officer. I told him to rewind the live feed exactly 12 minutes. The officer kept one hand resting firmly on his holster while he leaned over the bright screen. His partner stepped closer to watch. The high-definition video began to play. It showed the completely empty kitchen. Then Cynthia walked into the frame. The officers watched in absolute silence as my wife stood alone by the island. They watched her take a deep, stabilizing breath to prepare herself. They watched her raise her own manicured hands to her face and violently drag her fingernails down her own cheeks, drawing bright red lines of fresh blood. They watched her grab the collar of her expensive silk blouse and rip it open with brute force. They watched her practice a terrified scream silently in the air before finally turning and sprinting out the front door into the darkness. The video was absolute, undeniable, and entirely damning. The lead officer let out a slow, heavy breath. The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a deep, professional disgust. He holstered his service weapon. His partners did the same. The officer looked at me and formally apologized for the forced entry and the damage to my front door. He said they were legally obligated to treat every emergency call as a lethal threat until proven otherwise. I nodded respectfully, telling him he did exactly what his rigorous training required. The officers turned around and walked back out the shattered front door. I stood in the quiet hallway and listened to the immediate confrontation outside. The lead officer did not offer Cynthia a single ounce of sympathy. He spoke to her with a loud, incredibly harsh voice that carried easily through the cool night air. He told her they had just watched the security footage of her mutilating her own face. He informed her that filing a false police report to manufacture a violent domestic charge is a severe criminal offense punishable by jail time. He told her the only reason she was not leaving in the back of a squad car tonight was because her husband had graciously declined to press immediate charges. He ordered her to stay away from the emergency dispatch lines and warned her that if they were called to this address again under false pretenses, she would be the one wearing handcuffs. The heavy patrol vehicles backed slowly out of my driveway. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared down the quiet suburban street, plunging my house back into the dark. Cynthia walked slowly back through the broken front door frame. Her face was incredibly pale, streaked with dried blood and completely ruined makeup. Xavier and Megan finally crept down the wooden stairs, staring at the shattered door and the police tire tracks on the lawn in absolute shock. Cynthia looked at me standing perfectly still in the dead center of the hallway. The horrifying realization hit her like a massive freight train. She realized I was the one who had planted the camera. She realized her entire master plan had just been effortlessly destroyed by the very man she thought was losing his mind. A guttural scream of pure animalistic rage ripped from her throat. She lunged forward with surprising speed, raising her hands to strike my face. She expected me to cower. She expected the frail, confused old man to fall backward in fear. She was entirely wrong. I stepped directly into her attack and caught both of her wrists mid-air. My grip was like a steel vise. I twisted her arms down, forcing her to stop dead in her tracks. Xavier yelled my name and rushed forward to intervene, but I locked eyes with him, projecting a terrifying, silent threat that froze him instantly in place. I looked back at my wife. The pathetic, vulnerable mask was completely gone. The old, confused man was entirely dead. I leaned in close to her bleeding face and spoke in a low, vibrating whisper that echoed through the silent house. I told her the childish game was officially over. I told her I knew all about the forged quitclaim deed hidden in Megan's name. I knew about the massive federal wire fraud they had committed. I knew she had poisoned my evening tea. I released her wrists violently, shoving her back toward her son. I told them the real war had just begun, and I was going to financially and legally bury every single one of them. The silence in the hallway was absolute and suffocating. Cynthia, Xavier, and Megan stood completely frozen like statues, their eyes wide with a terrifying new reality. For months they had treated me like a decaying piece of furniture, a senile old fool who could not even remember where he left his car keys. Now they were staring directly at a phantom investigator who had systematically dismantled their entire criminal operation from the shadows. I watched the blood completely drain from Megan's face. She instinctively took a step back, hiding behind my son. Xavier opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some pathetic excuse or beg for a shred of mercy, but his voice completely failed him. His jaw trembled silently. He finally realized that every single moment of his arrogant psychological manipulation had been meticulously recorded and categorized as federal evidence. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been violently inverted right before their eyes. I did not need to raise my voice or resort to physical violence. The cold, undeniable weight of the truth was already crushing them into the hardwood floor. I turned my back on them and began walking slowly up the stairs, leaving them to suffocate in their own guilt. I had only reached the landing of the second floor when a sharp electronic ringtone shattered the heavy silence downstairs. It was Megan's cell phone. I paused, resting my hand on the smooth wooden banister, and listened intently in the darkness. I heard her rummage frantically through her designer purse, her breathing rapid and shallow. She answered the call with a shaky, breathless voice, expecting it to be another one of Xavier's angry creditors. The caller was not a friend, a family member, or a local loan shark. It was the high-security fraud prevention department of her private bank. Because I had deliberately wired that $50,000 from a highly monitored federal escrow account directly into her newly formed shell company, the federal algorithms had flagged the transaction the very second it processed. I listened with immense satisfaction as Megan's shaky voice turned into a shrill shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. She demanded to know why her online login credentials were not working and why her debit cards were declining. A few seconds later, she dropped her phone onto the floor. It landed with a loud, sharp crack. She grabbed her hair with both hands and screamed that her entire corporate bank account had been permanently frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. The automated money laundering investigation had officially locked down every single penny she possessed. The $50,000 she thought she had so cleverly stolen from a helpless old man had acted exactly like a digital tracking die. It had infected her entire financial network, triggering a massive federal freeze that completely paralyzed her shell company and her personal assets. She sobbed uncontrollably, dropping to her knees on the floor. She confessed to Xavier that the bank representative informed her she was now under active, ongoing investigation by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Her bottomless greed had completely blinded her to the basic fundamental rules of financial security. She had voluntarily accepted a heavily monitored wire transfer and tried to instantly wash it through a fake real estate ledger to legitimize the funds. I smiled coldly in the darkness of the upstairs hallway. The bait had been taken. The hook was set deep in her jaw, and the federal government was already reeling her in with absolute precision. She was trapped in a financial cage she had built with her own two hands. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves when the walls finally start closing in. The fragile, toxic alliance between my wife, my son, and his wife instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces right in my foyer. Xavier did not rush to the floor to comfort his sobbing wife. Instead, he turned on her with a vicious, explosive fury that echoed through the house. He screamed that she was an absolute idiot for using her primary business account to receive the stolen money. He blamed her entirely for the federal investigation, conveniently forgetting that he was the one who had begged me for the cash on his hands and knees just 24 hours ago. Megan snapped back instantly, her tears drying into pure defensive venom. She yelled that she only created the shell company because his massive hidden startup debts were threatening to leave them entirely homeless. She called him a pathetic failure who had to rely on manipulating his own father to survive. The two of them stood there viciously tearing each other apart with brutal insults, while Cynthia leaned heavily against the wall, hyperventilating. My wife was in a state of total catastrophic shock. The freezing of Megan's accounts meant there was absolutely no cash left to save her. Cynthia needed hundreds of thousands of dollars immediately to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney to fight the state embezzlement charges and keep her out of prison. She had secretly planned to use the $50,000 from Megan as an emergency retainer fee by tomorrow morning. Now that money was locked inside an impenetrable federal vault. Cynthia slid slowly down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the shattered front door. She buried her face in her hands and began to wail. She was completely bankrupt, professionally ruined, and facing years in a state penitentiary. But Megan was not ready to completely surrender to the reality of her demise. I watched from the top of the stairs as she suddenly scrambled across the floor and snatched up her cracked cell phone. Her eyes were wild with the manic, terrifying desperation of a cornered animal realizing it has one final breath left. She looked at Xavier and Cynthia, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. She told them the IRS freeze was only a temporary setback and that they still had one massive lifeline left to pull them out of this nightmare. She quickly opened her encrypted email application. She pulled up the forged commercial real estate contract containing my fake signature and the fraudulent notary stamp. The Atlanta development firm had promised a non-refundable $1 million earnest money deposit the exact moment they received the fully executed document. Megan declared she was sending the contract directly to the buyer right now to trigger the massive payout. She hit the send button before Xavier or Cynthia could even process what she was doing. She truly thought she was securing their grand escape. She had absolutely no idea she had just voluntarily transmitted a forged document across state lines using a digital network. She had just officially committed federal wire fraud. Megan's thumb slammed down on the glowing screen before anyone could stop her. Xavier lunged forward, desperately trying to snatch the cracked device from her hands, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The small swoosh sound of the outgoing email echoed loudly in the silent foyer. It was the digital sound of a prison cell locking shut. She looked up at her husband, her chest heaving fully, believing she had just initiated a $1 million rescue mission. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at the absolute pinnacle of human stupidity. A forged signature on a physical piece of paper is a severe state-level crime. But the exact moment she used an internet service provider to transmit that fraudulent commercial real estate contract to a buyer in a different state, she crossed a massive, unforgiving legal boundary. She had just committed federal wire fraud. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not care about family drama or desperate startup debts. They only care about the digital footprint of a felony, and she had just handed them a perfectly wrapped confession. Xavier stared at his wife in absolute horror, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what she had done. He grabbed his coat, turned his back on both his wife and his mother, and walked out the shattered front door into the night, without saying a single word. The following 3 days were a masterclass in silent psychological warfare. Cynthia did not speak to me. She moved through the house like a highly caffeinated ghost, aggressively ignoring the fact that her professional life had been completely incinerated. Her real estate brokerage remained locked down by state investigators, and her bank accounts were frozen solid. Her only remaining lifeline was the emergency guardianship hearing she had somehow managed to expedite through the county probate court. She truly believed that if she could just get a judge to declare me legally incompetent, she could instantly seize my $2 million retirement fund, pay off her massive embezzlement debts, and miraculously avoid state prison. She used her last functioning credit card to hire a notoriously aggressive probate attorney known for bulldozing through family courts. I let her operate under her false blanket of security. I spent my days quietly meeting with Howard Kaplan in his secure downtown office. We were not preparing a standard legal defense. We were meticulously constructing a federal execution. I have spent my entire adult life testifying as an expert forensic witness in highly contested federal fraud cases. I know the exact rhythm of a courtroom. I know how judges think, how they weigh evidence, and exactly how they react to blatant perjury. Howard and I spent hours organizing the high-definition surveillance videos, the audio recordings, the IRS money laundering alerts, and the federal trust documents into heavy, undeniable evidence binders. We were not just going to prove I was sane. We were going to systematically dismantle their entire lives right in front of the presiding judge. The morning of the hearing was cold and aggressively bright. I wore my best charcoal gray tailored suit, the exact one I used to wear when testifying against Wall Street embezzlers. I walked into the county courthouse with my head held high, projecting the absolute calm of a man who held all the winning cards. The probate courtroom was a sterile, intimidating environment with heavy oak paneling and harsh fluorescent lighting. I took my seat at the defense table. I sat entirely alone. Howard Kaplan was intentionally absent, waiting patiently in the corridor for my specific signal. Cynthia sat at the petitioner's table across the aisle, flanked by her sleazy, overpriced attorney. She wore a conservative navy blue dress, her hair pulled back tightly to emphasize the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. She was aggressively playing the role of the battered, terrified wife pushed to the absolute brink. Xavier and Megan sat right behind her in the gallery, holding hands and looking incredibly tense. Megan kept checking her phone, desperately hoping to see $1 million wire transfer from the Atlanta buyers that was never going to arrive. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the Honorable Judge Harrison took his seat. He was an older, stern-looking man with a reputation for having absolutely zero patience for family drama. The bailiff called the court to order, and the final battle officially commenced. Cynthia's attorney immediately called her to the witness stand. She walked up to the box with a slow, trembling gait. She placed her right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth, immediately committing perjury the second she opened her mouth. Her attorney gently guided her through a highly rehearsed narrative of my supposed mental collapse. She cried on absolute command. She told the judge about my imaginary memory lapses, my supposed financial recklessness, and my aggressive outbursts. She boldly brought up the incident with the paring knife from a few nights ago, conveniently omitting the fact that the police officers had cleared me and explicitly threatened to arrest her for filing a false report. She claimed I was a massive danger to myself and my family. She sobbed heavily into a tissue, begging the judge to grant her full medical and financial guardianship so she could place me in a secure memory care facility before I hurt someone. Judge Harrison listened intently, taking careful notes. He looked down at me with a gaze full of pity and solemn resignation. He was clearly buying every single word of her tragic performance. Cynthia's attorney thanked her and proudly announced that he had one final irrefutable piece of evidence to present to the court. He stated that he had brought in an independent, highly respected medical professional to confirm my severe cognitive decline. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Dr. Miller walked confidently down the center aisle wearing a pristine white coat over an expensive suit, ready to deliver the fraudulent medical diagnosis that would legally end my life. He stepped into the witness box completely unaware that he was walking directly into a trap. I sat perfectly still, maintaining my posture as a helpless old man. The judge leaned forward, preparing to hear the final medical nail in my coffin. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I pressed a single button, sending a blank text message to Howard Kaplan waiting outside. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, resounding thud mere seconds after I pressed send. Howard Kaplan strode down the center aisle. He did not walk like a standard family lawyer. He moved with the aggressive, undeniable presence of a federal prosecutor stepping onto a battlefield he had already conquered. He carried a thick black leather briefcase in his left hand. Cynthia's attorney stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hanging open in mid-sentence. Cynthia spun around in her chair. The fake tears on her cheeks dried instantly, replaced by a look of genuine, unfiltered panic. She recognized Howard from the few times he had visited our house decades ago. She knew exactly what kind of law he practiced. Judge Harrison banged his gavel sharply against the wooden block, demanding to know who was interrupting his courtroom. Howard did not pause. He walked directly past the petitioner's table and stopped right beside me. He placed his heavy briefcase onto the defense table with a solid thud. He looked up at the bench and introduced himself in a booming, authoritative voice. He formally announced that he was my retained legal counsel specializing in complex asset protection and corporate fraud. He respectfully requested the court's permission to conduct the cross-examination of the medical witness. Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes, clearly intrigued by the sudden dramatic shift in the atmosphere. He nodded once, granting Howard the floor. The execution was officially underway. Dr. Miller sat in the witness box, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine white coat. He looked highly uncomfortable. His eyes darted nervously between Cynthia and Howard. Cynthia's attorney quickly tried to regain control of the narrative. He asked Dr. Miller to confirm his professional diagnosis of my mental state. Miller cleared his throat and confidently stated for the official court record that I was suffering from advanced stage 2 dementia. He claimed my cognitive functions were severely compromised and that I required immediate full-time institutionalized care. Howard Kaplan did not object. He stood perfectly still, letting the doctor dig his own grave under oath. Once the direct examination concluded, Howard stepped up to the wooden podium. He did not ask Dr. Miller a single question about my medical health. Instead, Howard pulled a crisp, stapled document from his binder. He asked the doctor to confirm his primary business address. Miller blinked, confused by the sudden pivot, but recited the address of his lavish downtown clinic. Howard then asked if it was true that Miller's private practice was currently leasing that commercial space from a property management firm owned entirely by Cynthia. Cynthia's attorney shot up from his chair, loudly objecting to the question, claiming it had absolutely no relevance to my medical evaluation. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his judicial instincts fully activated. He overruled the objection immediately and ordered the doctor to answer the question. Miller swallowed hard. The confidence drained entirely from his face. He mumbled a quiet confirmation. Howard took a step closer to the witness stand. His voice grew sharper, echoing off the high ceiling. He asked Dr. Miller to confirm to the court that his clinic was currently 6 months behind on rent. He asked him to confirm that he personally owed Cynthia's firm exactly $112,000 in severe financial arrears. The courtroom fell dead silent. Xavier and Megan shifted uncomfortably in the gallery. Cynthia stared at the wooden table, her face completely pale. Miller stammered, his eyes wide with rising terror. He tried to claim that his personal finances had nothing to do with his professional medical integrity. Howard Kaplan smiled. It was a cold, merciless expression. Howard opened his black leather briefcase. He pulled out 3 thick, identical evidence binders. He handed one to the bailiff to pass to the judge and dropped another aggressively onto the table right in front of Cynthia's attorney. He kept the third for himself. Howard announced that the binder contained certified copies of Dr. Miller's commercial lease, the formal notices of default, and his heavily maxed-out personal credit statements. But Howard was not finished. He stated that a financial motive was only the first half of the crime. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. He requested permission to submit a certified, unedited audio recording into the official court record. The judge granted the request, his eyes locked firmly on the trembling doctor. Howard placed the small speaker on the edge of the podium and pressed play. The pristine audio of my fraudulent medical evaluation filled the massive courtroom. Everyone heard Dr. Miller's patronizing voice asking me rigged questions. They heard him deliberately interrupt me to break my concentration. They heard him boldly fabricate a sequence of words he had never spoken. The recording was absolute, undeniable proof of a licensed physician actively manufacturing a false diagnosis to steal an old man's freedom. Dr. Miller gripped the edges of the wooden witness box so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He looked like a man standing on the gallows listening to the trapdoor latch being slowly pulled away. The recording ended with the sound of Miller promising to discuss my long-term care plan directly with Cynthia. Howard clicked the player off. The silence that followed was heavier than lead. Howard looked directly at the judge. He stated firmly that this was not a medical evaluation. It was a contracted hit on my legal autonomy purchased by a desperate woman trying to erase her own massive financial crimes. Judge Harrison's face turned deep red with absolute righteous fury. He slammed his gavel down with explosive force. He ordered Dr. Miller to remain seated in the witness box. The judge looked directly at the court bailiff and instructed him to immediately contact the state medical board and the local district attorney's office. He declared that he was holding Dr. Miller in direct contempt of court for committing blatant perjury and aggravated medical fraud right in front of his bench. 2 armed deputies stepped forward, taking up positions directly behind the trembling doctor. Cynthia watched her primary weapon get instantly neutralized and placed under armed guard. Her entire emergency guardianship petition was collapsing violently around her. Her sleazy attorney was sweating profusely, frantically flipping through his pathetic notes. He realized his client had just dragged him into a massive federal conspiracy. In a desperate blind panic to save the hearing, the attorney jumped up from his chair. He shouted that regardless of the doctor's credibility, the court still needed to address my violent behavior. He loudly reminded the judge about the police incident, claiming I had threatened to butcher my family with a knife just 3 nights ago. He begged the judge to focus on the immediate physical danger I supposedly posed to the community. Howard Kaplan turned away from the podium and looked directly at me. We both shared a brief, imperceptible nod. The attorney had just blindly stepped directly onto our second landmine. Howard calmly reached back into his black briefcase and pulled out a highly encrypted flash drive. Howard held the sleek metal flash drive high in the air for the judge to see. He stated clearly that the petitioner's attorney had just forcefully opened the door to character evidence regarding the events of that specific night. He formally requested the court's permission to play a single video file captured by a hidden security camera located inside my living room. Cynthia's attorney objected wildly, waving his hands and claiming the footage was unverified and highly prejudicial. Judge Harrison silenced the panicked lawyer with a single sharp glare and immediately granted Howard's request. The court clerk walked over, took the flash drive, and plugged it directly into the courtroom's primary presentation system. The 4 massive flat screens mounted on the walls flickered to life. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the wooden defense table. I did not even look at the screens. I looked directly at my wife. Cynthia leaned forward in her chair, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. She had completely forgotten about the camera. She truly believed the police had ignored it or that the footage was safely locked away on my personal phone. She had absolutely no idea that Howard possessed a fully certified time-stamped copy of her psychotic breakdown. The high-definition video began playing simultaneously across the massive screens. The audio feed was crystal clear, capturing the ambient silence of my dark house. Everyone in the packed gallery watched the empty kitchen. Then Cynthia walked into the frame. The entire courtroom gasped collectively as they watched my wife stand perfectly alone next to the marble island. They watched her take a deep, stabilizing breath. They watched her raise her own manicured hands to her face and violently drag her fingernails down her cheeks, drawing bright red lines of fresh blood. They watched her grab the collar of her expensive silk blouse and rip it open with brute force. They watched her practice a terrified scream silently in the air before finally turning and sprinting out the front door into the darkness to greet the armed police officers. Howard pressed a button on his remote, pausing the video right on the frozen high-definition frame of Cynthia's heavily scratched, bleeding face. He turned to the judge and stated that the responding police officers had already reviewed this exact footage on the night of the incident. He added that the local precinct had officially filed a report citing Cynthia for manufacturing a false domestic violence claim and wasting emergency resources. The absolute silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Harrison stared at the frozen image on the screen, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He looked down at Cynthia with a level of pure judicial contempt that could freeze boiling water. Cynthia's high-priced probate attorney stood completely frozen at his podium. He looked at the massive screen, then slowly looked down at his client. He realized instantly that Cynthia had lied to him, manipulated him, and forced him to present a fabricated, highly illegal domestic violence claim to a sitting judge. In the legal profession, presenting knowingly false evidence is a fast track to permanent disbarment. The attorney did not hesitate for a single second. He scrambled to gather his legal pads, shoving them haphazardly into his expensive leather briefcase. He addressed the judge with a shaky, breathless voice, formally requesting to withdraw as petitioner's counsel, effective immediately due to severe and irreconcilable ethical conflicts. Judge Harrison granted the withdrawal without a moment of hesitation. The attorney practically sprinted out of the courtroom, leaving Cynthia sitting entirely alone at the massive wooden table. She had no corrupt doctor to back her up. She had no lawyer to defend her. Her entire manufactured reality had been violently stripped away in less than 20 minutes. Cynthia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, defeated sobs. But Howard Kaplan was not finished. A trained forensic accountant does not stop fighting when the primary target is neutralized. We follow the money trail until every single conspirator is fully exposed and brought to justice. Howard turned his sharp, predatory gaze away from Cynthia and looked directly into the gallery. He locked eyes with my son. Howard formally requested the court's permission to call Xavier to the witness stand as a hostile witness regarding the systemic financial abuse of a vulnerable elder. Judge Harrison immediately agreed, leaning forward with intense interest. Xavier physically recoiled in his wooden pew. He looked around wildly for an exit, but the heavy courtroom doors were closed, and an armed bailiff was already walking directly toward him. Xavier stood up on visibly shaking legs and slowly made his way to the witness box. He placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath with a voice so weak it barely registered on the courtroom microphone. Howard approached the podium carrying a fresh stack of dense financial documents. He did not yell. He spoke with the quiet, deadly precision of a surgeon operating with a scalpel. He asked Xavier to confirm his current employment status. Xavier stared at his shoes and admitted he was currently unemployed. Howard then displayed the certified banking records of the $50,000 wire transfer I had sent to Megan's newly formed shell company just days prior. Howard asked Xavier how an unemployed man and his wife managed to trigger a massive ongoing federal money laundering investigation by the Internal Revenue Service in less than 24 hours. Xavier turned completely white. The blood drained entirely from his face. He realized Howard knew absolutely everything about the frozen bank accounts and the federal dragnet closing in around them. Howard pressed the attack harder. He stepped right up to the edge of the witness box. He asked Xavier to confirm under penalty of federal perjury if he and his wife had intentionally extorted a senior citizen for $50,000 under the false pretense of paying off violent loan sharks. Xavier opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the judge, then at me, completely paralyzed by the terrifying weight of his crimes. He was visibly cracking. He was taking a deep breath, preparing to confess to everything and throw his wife entirely under the bus just to save himself from a maximum security prison sentence. Megan saw his resolve crumbling from her seat in the gallery. She saw her husband preparing to send her away. She could not handle the immense pressure. Megan jumped out of her seat, ignoring all courtroom decorum. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Howard and screamed at the top of her lungs. She yelled that they did not need the miserable $50,000 anymore and that they did not care about the IRS freeze. She proudly announced to the judge and the entire courtroom that she had fully executed the commercial real estate contract last night. She screamed that a non-refundable $1 million earnest money deposit was currently being wired to her company for the Georgia property and that they had finally won. Megan's voice echoed violently off the high mahogany ceilings of the courtroom. The entire gallery erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispers. Judge Harrison slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with such explosive force that the handle nearly splintered upon impact. He demanded absolute silence, pointing the head of the gavel directly at Megan. He ordered the armed court bailiff to immediately detain her if she uttered one more word out of turn. Megan stood frozen in the gallery, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She genuinely thought she had just delivered the winning blow. She believed that the promise of $1 million would somehow validate her actions, intimidate the court, and force the judge to recognize her fabricated authority. She was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Howard Kaplan did not miss a single beat. He looked up at the bench with the calm, predatory focus of a seasoned prosecutor. He formally requested that the court reporter permanently enter Megan's spontaneous, unprompted admission of executing a commercial real estate contract involving my personal assets into the official legal record. Judge Harrison nodded firmly, his eyes fixed on Megan with absolute judicial disgust. The court reporter's fingers flew across the stenotype machine, officially documenting her federal confession. Howard then turned his attention away from the crumbling family in the gallery. He looked directly at me and officially called me to the witness stand. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for since the afternoon I found that treacherous red folder sitting on Cynthia's desk. The frail, confused, and terrified old man died right there at the defense table. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up. I did not lean on the table for support. My spine was perfectly straight. My shoulders were broad and squared. I walked across the courtroom floor with the heavy, measured, and entirely confident stride of a veteran federal investigator. The collective shock radiating through the room was palpable. Cynthia stared at me as if she were looking at a phantom. Xavier slumped down in his seat, his jaw hanging open, completely defeated by the terrifying realization that his father had been playing them all along. I stepped into the witness box, placed my right hand firmly on the worn leather Bible, and swore the oath with a crisp, booming voice that reached every single corner of the massive room. Howard approached the podium with a slight, highly respectful nod. He did not treat me like an elderly victim of elder abuse. He treated me like his star expert witness. He asked me to state my full name and my professional background for the official record. I looked directly at Judge Harrison. I told him my name is Carlton. I told him I had spent 40 consecutive years working as a senior forensic accountant for the federal government, specializing exclusively in complex financial fraud, corporate embezzlement, and severe identity theft. Howard walked back to his briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He asked me to describe the events of the past week from my professional investigative perspective. I spoke with absolute clinical precision. I did not use emotional language. I laid out the cold, undeniable facts. I explained how I discovered the fraudulent medical documents and the fake quitclaim deed in my wife's office. I detailed the systematic psychological warfare they waged against me under my own roof. I told the judge about the intentionally misplaced car keys, the fabricated conversations, and the constant aggressive gaslighting designed to make me doubt my own sanity. I referenced the high-definition video already submitted into evidence, reminding the court that Cynthia had deliberately crushed a heavy sedative into my nightly tea to manufacture the symptoms of cognitive decline she so desperately needed for her narrative. I explained how I had secretly poured the poisoned tea into a potted plant and played the role of a heavily sedated man to gather irrefutable intelligence. I told the court about the $50,000 wire transfer, explaining exactly how I used a federally monitored escrow account to intentionally trigger the Internal Revenue Service money laundering algorithms the moment Megan moved the cash. The judge stopped taking notes for a moment. He took off his reading glasses and stared at me with a look of profound respect and sheer astonishment. He was looking at a masterclass in counter-surveillance. Howard wasted no time transitioning to the final nail in their coffin. He directed the court clerk to pull up the encrypted file I had previously submitted to his office. The 4 massive flat screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life, displaying the fully executed commercial real estate purchase agreement. Howard asked me to identify the document for the record. I looked at the bright screens and stated that it was a fraudulent contract attempting to sell my family's 300 acres of ancestral land in Georgia to an Atlanta-based commercial development firm for $4.5 million. Howard zoomed in on the final page of the document, highlighting the signature line in bright yellow. He asked me if I had signed that binding legal contract. I stated firmly that I absolutely had not. Howard asked me to explain how I acquired the document. I turned my attention back to the judge. I explained exactly how I had deployed a custom data extraction malware program via a hidden USB drive to instantly clone this specific file directly from Megan's unsecured laptop while she was distracted by a neighborhood inspector outside our home. I then proceeded to systematically dissect the forgery right in front of the entire court. I pointed out the severe lack of natural variation in the ink flow on the screen, explaining that it was a classic, undeniable indicator of a slow, deliberate tracing rather than a fluid, authentic signature. I highlighted the digital pixelation around the edges of the state notary stamp, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was a high-resolution scan illegally photoshopped onto the page to bypass the physical presence requirement. The courtroom was completely spellbound. I was providing the court with a flawless step-by-step roadmap of a multi-million-dollar felony orchestrated by my own family. I looked directly at Megan sitting in the gallery. I explained to the judge that by using an interstate internet connection to send this forged document to the buyers in Atlanta just last night, Megan had officially triggered the federal statute for wire fraud. I stated that the crime was no longer a domestic dispute, but an active federal felony. Cynthia put her head down on the heavy wooden table, completely broken and sobbing uncontrollably. Xavier buried his face in his hands, rocking back and forth in pure agony. But Megan absolutely refused to surrender to the reality of her destruction. Her phone suddenly vibrated violently in her hand. She looked down at the bright screen. A twisted, triumphant smile broke across her face completely, ignoring the armed bailiff standing just inches away from her shoulder. She jumped up from the wooden pew. She raised the glowing phone high in the air and screamed that the $1 million earnest money wire transfer had just officially cleared into her secondary corporate banking account. She looked me dead in the eye, completely consumed by her own toxic greed and blinding, unhinged arrogance. She laughed a harsh, manic laugh that echoed terribly through the silent courtroom. She yelled that I was far too late, that the massive financial contract was fully funded, and that the Georgia land was officially gone forever. Megan stood in the gallery with her arm raised high, waving her cracked smartphone like a victorious gladiator holding up a severed head. Her manic laughter bounced sharply off the heavy mahogany paneling of the courtroom. She honestly believed that the arrival of $1 million in a corporate bank account instantly validated her entire criminal enterprise. She thought the sheer volume of the money would somehow intimidate the judge, override the forged signature, and force the legal system to bow to her newly acquired wealth. I stood in the witness box and looked down at her. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel betrayed. I only felt a profound, freezing pity for a woman who was so entirely blinded by her own greed that she could not see the massive federal guillotine dropping rapidly toward her neck. Judge Harrison did not bang his gavel again. He sat completely still behind the high wooden bench, his eyes fixed on Megan with a look of absolute, silent horror. He was a seasoned judge who had presided over hundreds of complex legal battles, but he had never witnessed a criminal voluntarily confess to a multi-million-dollar federal felony with such overwhelming, unhinged pride. I turned my attention away from my daughter-in-law and looked directly at Howard Kaplan. Howard was standing at the podium, his face a mask of absolute predatory calm. He gave me a single slow nod. The final trap was officially primed. I looked back up at Judge Harrison and spoke with a voice that was perfectly steady, echoing clearly through the stunned silence of the courtroom. I formally requested the court's permission to address the petitioner's sudden outburst regarding the commercial real estate transaction. The judge leaned slowly back in his heavy leather chair. He folded his hands together, resting them on top of his legal pad. He gave me a curt, firm nod, granting me the floor to deliver the final execution. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a professor delivering a final lecture to a failing student. I looked directly at Megan. I told her that I fully believed the $1 million earnest money deposit had just cleared into her secondary corporate account. I told her I had no doubt that the Atlanta commercial development firm had honored their side of the fraudulent contract upon receiving the forged paperwork. I watched her chest puff out slightly, her twisted smile widening as she thought I was finally conceding defeat. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds before I dropped the massive legal anvil directly onto her head. I told her that the money she just received was entirely real, but the contract she used to secure it was completely worthless. I looked at the judge and asked Howard to provide the court with the final piece of documentary evidence from his black leather briefcase. Howard reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavily bound folder embossed with a gold legal seal. He handed the original copy directly to the court clerk and placed a duplicate firmly on the edge of the podium. I stated for the official court record that the document was a fully executed, federally registered, irrevocable trust agreement. I explained that exactly 20 years ago, long before my son had even met his wife, I had recognized the immense historical and financial value of my grandfather's 300 acres of land in Georgia. I knew that immense wealth could easily corrupt future generations. To protect that sacred legacy from greedy descendants, bad business investments, or potential litigation, I transferred the total ownership of the entire property into an absolute blind trust. I turned my body in the witness box so I was facing my family directly. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable penetrated their panicked minds. I explained the fundamental legal mechanics of an irrevocable trust. I told them that an irrevocable trust is not merely a piece of paper. It is a distinct, independent legal entity. It has its own federal tax identification number. It files its own corporate tax returns. It operates entirely outside of my personal control. The exact moment I signed that trust agreement 2 decades ago, I permanently surrendered all legal rights, titles, and ownership interests in that Georgia property. I am not the owner of that land. I cannot sell that land. I cannot borrow against that land. I cannot authorize any construction on that land. Therefore, any commercial real estate contract bearing my signature, whether it is genuine or forged, is legally meaningless. It is a dead piece of paper attempting to sell an asset that the seller does not even possess. The twisted, arrogant smile instantly vanished from Megan's face. Her arm, still holding the glowing smartphone, slowly dropped to her side as the horrifying reality of my words began to penetrate her thick skull. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the wooden witness box. I transitioned from explaining the trust to explaining the catastrophic financial crime she had just completed. I told her that because the real estate contract was completely void, she had not successfully sold the property. Instead, she had just used a fabricated document featuring a forged signature and a fake notary stamp to fraudulently induce a commercial buyer into wiring $1 million across state lines. I reminded her of the exact federal statute for wire fraud, noting that the crime is considered fully executed the moment the illegal funds hit the receiving bank account. By celebrating the arrival of that money, she was not celebrating a successful real estate deal. She was celebrating the successful completion of aggravated grand larceny and massive federal wire fraud. I watched the remaining color completely drain from her face. Her skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the wooden floor of the pew. She had thought the money was her ultimate salvation. She now realized the money was the physical, undeniable proof of her federal felony. The commercial buyers in Atlanta were going to realize the deed was entirely invalid the moment their own attorneys attempted to file the paperwork with the county clerk. They would instantly report the massive theft to the federal authorities. Furthermore, that $1 million was now sitting trapped inside a corporate shell account that was already frozen and actively monitored by the Internal Revenue Service due to the $50,000 bait I had set earlier in the week. She could not withdraw a single cent to hire a defense attorney. She could not transfer the money to an offshore account. She was completely trapped in a financial prison of her own making, holding $1 million of stolen corporate funds with the entire federal government watching her every single move. Xavier sat in the pew next to his wife, his entire body shaking violently. He buried his face in his hands, realizing that his own signature was likely on some of the supporting corporate documents for her shell company, making him an active co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar federal crime. Cynthia remained slumped over the petitioner's table. She did not even look up. Her emergency guardianship petition was dead. Her real estate brokerage was dead. Her future was entirely gone. She was going to state prison for embezzlement, and her son and daughter-in-law were heading to federal prison for wire fraud. Judge Harrison sat frozen on the bench, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He looked at me with a profound sense of awe. He had never seen a private citizen systematically dismantle an entire criminal syndicate with such ruthless, calculated precision. I stepped back from the microphone and looked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Howard Kaplan checked his gold wristwatch and offered me a final knowing smile. The trap had been fully articulated, the evidence was perfectly documented, and the confessions were permanently entered into the official court record. We did not have to wait for the Atlanta buyers to report the crime. Howard had already contacted the authorities hours ago. Heavy, synchronized footsteps suddenly echoed loudly in the marble hallway outside, marching rapidly toward the courtroom doors. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A team of 6 men and women strode into the room with the aggressive, undeniable authority of federal law enforcement. 2 of them wore dark suits with badges clipped to their belts. The others were uniformed state police officers. The lead FBI agent walked directly down the center aisle, his eyes locked firmly on the gallery. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at me. He stopped right at the wooden pew where my son and daughter-in-law were sitting. He announced in a loud, booming voice that he possessed active federal arrest warrants for Megan and Xavier. He stated the charges clearly for the entire courtroom to hear: conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. Megan tried to back away, her eyes wide with animalistic terror, but she had absolutely nowhere to go. A female federal agent stepped forward, grabbed Megan by the shoulder, and spun her around. The agent forced Megan's hands behind her back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists echoed violently through the silent room. Megan completely lost her mind. She shrieked, kicking her legs and trying to pull away from the agent. She screamed that it was all a massive misunderstanding and that she was a legitimate business owner. The agent ignored her frantic lies and began reading her the Miranda rights in a cold, monotone voice. Xavier did not fight back. The moment the officers approached him, his legs completely gave out. He collapsed onto the wooden floor of the gallery, sobbing hysterically like a terrified child. He held his hands up in the air, begging the officers not to hurt him. He immediately started babbling desperately, trying to trade his wife for his own freedom. He cried out that Megan was the mastermind, that she was the one who forged my signature, and that she was the one who clicked send on the email. Megan stopped struggling for a split second, turning her head to stare at her husband in absolute shock. The fragile, toxic loyalty between them disintegrated instantly. She spat vicious insults at him, calling him a spineless coward who orchestrated the entire plot to cover his miserable startup debts. The officers hauled Xavier to his feet, slapped the handcuffs securely onto his wrists, and dragged him toward the aisle. They were a pathetic, miserable sight, turning on each other like starving wolves the very second the consequences arrived. Cynthia watched her only son being dragged out of the courtroom in heavy steel chains. She remained slumped over the petitioner's table, too paralyzed by shock to even speak. She likely thought she was safe from the federal sweep because her crimes were strictly handled at the state level. She was entirely wrong. 2 state investigators from the Financial Crimes Division separated from the federal team and walked directly toward her table. The lead investigator looked down at her with absolute disgust. He informed Cynthia that her broker's license was now permanently revoked. He then announced that she was under arrest for multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, criminal commingling of client funds, and filing a false police report. He ordered her to stand up and put her hands behind her back. Cynthia slowly raised her head. She looked completely hollowed out. All the expensive makeup, the tailored designer dress, and the decades of manufactured superiority had melted away, leaving nothing but a broken, terrified criminal. She looked past the state investigator and locked her eyes directly on me. I stood calmly in the witness box, looking down at the woman I had been married to for 40 years. She mouthed my name silently. Her eyes begged me to intervene, to speak up and use my influence to somehow stop the inevitable. She wanted the soft, forgiving husband to magically reappear and save her from the nightmare she had created. I did not blink. I did not soften my posture. I looked right through her. I spoke in a low, steady voice that carried easily across the short distance between us. I told her that I was no longer her husband. I was the forensic auditor of her ruined life, and the audit was officially complete. The state investigator grabbed her arm, pulled her out of the wooden chair, and locked the heavy handcuffs around her wrists. She let out a single pathetic whimper as she was led down the center aisle. I watched the heavy wooden doors swing shut behind them. My family was gone. They had been completely excised from my life by the swift, unforgiving blade of the justice system. The courtroom was suddenly incredibly peaceful. Judge Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh. He ran a hand over his tired face and looked around the empty gallery. He turned his attention back to the defense table where Howard Kaplan was calmly organizing his thick evidence binders. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and cleared his throat. He stated for the official court record that the emergency petition for medical guardianship was denied with extreme prejudice. He ordered that all fabricated medical documents and false testimonies provided by the petitioner and her corrupt doctor be permanently stricken from the record and forwarded directly to the district attorney for further criminal prosecution. Judge Harrison then looked directly at me. The stern, intimidating judicial mask dropped for a brief moment. He offered me a look of profound, genuine respect. He commended me for my incredible composure and my brilliant, methodical approach to dismantling a highly complex criminal conspiracy. He stated that in his 30 years on the bench, he had never seen a private citizen protect their autonomy and their assets with such absolute perfection. I nodded respectfully, thanking the judge for his time and his unwavering commitment to the truth. I stepped down from the witness box. The heavy, suffocating burden I had been carrying in secret for the past week completely vanished from my shoulders. Howard Kaplan closed his black leather briefcase with a solid, satisfying snap. He walked over to me and extended his hand. I shook it firmly. We did not need to exchange a grand, dramatic speech. We were 2 old professionals who had just executed a flawless operation. He told me he would handle all the upcoming federal subpoenas and coordinate directly with the prosecutors to ensure my family received the maximum possible sentences for their crimes. I thanked him for his brilliant legal maneuvering and turned to leave. I walked down the center aisle of the empty courtroom. I pushed open the heavy double doors and walked down the long marble corridor of the county courthouse. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The air tasted cleaner and sharper than it had in decades. I took a deep, unrestricted breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The brutal war for my freedom was officially over, but I knew my work was not entirely finished. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my jacket pocket as I walked toward my car. I could not return to the massive suburban house I had shared with Cynthia. That house was a tainted crime scene filled with toxic memories and the lingering ghosts of their psychological torture. It was a fortress built on lies, and I had absolutely no desire to live inside it for another single day. I scrolled through my highly curated list of professional contacts and found the direct number for a private aggressive real estate investment firm. They specialized in purchasing luxury properties entirely in cash, bypassing the traditional market for immediate liquid closures. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. The final phase of my silent adjustment was about to begin. I was going to liquidate every single physical remnant of my past life, erase their footprint from my existence, and build an entirely new empire on my own terms. I stood in the sunlit parking lot of the courthouse and finalized my phone call with the private real estate investment firm. I did not care about getting the absolute maximum market value for the sprawling suburban house. I only cared about absolute immediate liquidity and a total erasure of my past. I told the senior acquisitions director that I was offering a pristine 4-bedroom colonial home in a highly coveted gated community at a straight 20% discount. The only condition was that the firm had to execute a cash closing within 48 hours and handle the total disposal of all remaining interior furnishings. The director did not hesitate for a single second. He recognized a highly lucrative distressed asset sale the moment he heard the cold determination in my voice. He promised to have his top legal team and an inspection crew standing at my front door by 4 o'clock that same afternoon. I ended the call and slid the encrypted phone back into my tailored suit pocket. The final physical tether to my disastrous 40-year marriage was about to be permanently severed. I got into my unmarked rental car and drove back to the house for the very last time. I did not feel a shred of nostalgia. I only felt the sharp driving focus of a man completing a total demolition. The house was eerily silent when I walked through the broken front door frame. The oppressive, toxic energy that Cynthia, Xavier, and Megan had dragged into these walls was completely gone, safely locked away inside federal and state holding cells. I walked slowly up the hardwood stairs to the master bedroom and pulled a single sturdy leather duffel bag from the back of the deep walk-in closet. I did not pack the expensive tailored suits Cynthia had forced me to buy for her pretentious country club dinners. I did not pack the meaningless crystal trinkets, the expensive luxury watches she gifted me to maintain appearances, or the heavy silver picture frames filled with fake smiling family portraits. I only packed the absolute essentials. I took my encrypted forensic laptop, my secure physical hardware wallets containing my digital assets, my grandfather's vintage gold pocket watch, and a few comfortable changes of clothes. Decades of working deep undercover in federal financial crimes had taught me the vital importance of traveling light. When an asset becomes fatally compromised, you do not try to salvage it. You cut your losses instantly, detach your emotions entirely, and walk away without looking back. Cynthia had spent 40 years filling this massive house with expensive, useless garbage to project a fraudulent image of extreme wealth to people she secretly despised. I was leaving it all behind for the liquidation crew to throw into a massive steel dumpster. Right at 4 o'clock, a sleek black town car pulled aggressively into my concrete driveway. 3 men in sharp-tailored business suits stepped out carrying heavy leather legal portfolios. I met them in the sunlit foyer. The lead acquisition agent walked through the spacious rooms with a highly critical, unemotional eye, aggressively taking notes on his digital tablet. He clearly noted the shattered front door frame and the violently overturned furniture in the living room, but he also recognized the pristine hardwood floors, the upgraded kitchen appliances, and the top-tier neighborhood valuation. He did not ask any personal questions about why a senior citizen was abruptly abandoning a fully furnished luxury home. In the ruthless world of high-speed cash acquisitions, the only things that matter are the clear title deed and the instant wire transfer. We sat down together at the formal mahogany dining room table. It was the exact same table where my son and daughter-in-law had aggressively gaslighted me, trying to convince me I was losing my mind just a few nights ago. Now I was using that very table to legally sign away the roof over their heads. I reviewed the dense, multi-page purchasing contract with the meticulous, unforgiving eye of a senior federal auditor. Everything was perfectly legal, ironclad, and stripped of any contingencies. I signed my name fluidly across the bottom line. The agent immediately tapped a button on his tablet to authorize the corporate wire transfer. Within 10 minutes, my secure banking application vibrated in my pocket, notifying me that the massive cash payment had successfully cleared into my private offshore escrow account. The house was officially no longer mine. I handed the lead agent my heavy brass set of house keys and walked out the front door carrying only my single leather duffel bag. I drove straight back downtown to Howard Kaplan's secure office suite for one final crucial meeting. We sat in his quiet leather-paneled room drinking incredibly expensive aged bourbon to celebrate our flawless legal victory. But I had one last piece of federal paperwork to execute before I completely disappeared from the public grid. We pulled out the massive gold embossed binder containing the irrevocable trust documents for the 300 acres of ancestral land in Georgia. The land was entirely safe from Cynthia and Xavier, but I needed to ensure it served a much higher permanent purpose than simply sitting empty in the rural countryside. I directed Howard to officially restructure the primary beneficiaries of the federal trust. I removed my bloodline entirely. I established a permanent, fully funded educational endowment dedicated to building a massive community center and a comprehensive agricultural scholarship program for underprivileged African American youth in the state of Georgia. I ensured that the board of directors would be populated exclusively by trusted independent community leaders and rigorous legal fiduciaries. I locked the legal framework so incredibly tightly that even if Xavier or Megan somehow survived their federal prison sentences and attempted a civil lawsuit decades from now, they would never be able to touch a single blade of grass on that property. My grandfather had worked his hands to the absolute bone to buy that land during a time of immense racial hostility. I was going to ensure his profound legacy actively uplifted the people who truly needed it, rather than feeding the bottomless toxic greed of an entitled family. I shook Howard's hand one last time, thanking him deeply for his brilliant legal mind and his unwavering decades-long loyalty. I walked out of his office building and stepped into the cool, refreshing evening air. I drove my car to a luxury high-rise condominium complex located in the absolute center of the bustling city. I had used a secure corporate alias to lease a stunning penthouse apartment on the very top floor, far above the noise and the chaos of the streets below. I rode the private glass-walled elevator up, stepped inside my new sanctuary, and dropped my duffel bag onto the pristine white marble floor. I walked straight out onto the massive glass balcony and looked down at the sprawling, glittering city lights spreading out for miles in every single direction. I poured myself a single glass of the finest scotch I owned. I did not feel lonely. I did not feel the crushing weight of a failed marriage or the tragic loss of a son. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I had survived the darkest, most intimate betrayal imaginable. I did not survive by screaming, crying, or fighting with my fists. I survived through the devastating, unstoppable power of silence, extreme patience, and flawless preparation. I allowed my enemies to underestimate me. I allowed them to build their own elaborate traps, and then I simply handed them the rope they needed to hang themselves. My name is Carlton. I am a 69-year-old retired forensic accountant. And I have finally learned that the most profound, lasting justice in this world does not require a single drop of blood. It only requires the undeniable razor-sharp edge of the truth. The metallic clink of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around Xavier and Megan's wrists signaled the absolute end of their reign of terror. They were no longer arrogant masterminds or entitled heirs demanding immediate wealth. They were federal inmates stripped of their power in a matter of seconds. The armed agents marched them roughly down the center aisle of the courtroom. Megan kept turning her head, sobbing hysterically, desperately searching for a sympathetic face in the empty gallery. There was absolutely no one left to manipulate. Xavier simply stared at his own chained hands. His shoulders completely slumped in total defeat. He had traded his freedom, his dignity, and his father for a worthless piece of forged paper. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them, sealing their grim fate, my attention shifted back to the petitioner's table. Cynthia had physically collapsed. She slid off her wooden chair and fell heavily onto the carpeted floor. Her expensive navy blue dress was wrinkled, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup. She curled into a tight ball, weeping with the terrifying realization that her life of luxury was entirely over. The state investigators stood patiently beside her, waiting for her to find the strength to stand up so they could process her arrest for massive corporate embezzlement. The wheels of the federal justice system grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 6 months later, the sentencing hearings concluded with absolute unforgiving brutality. Megan's desperate attempt to secure a lenient plea deal completely fell apart when the federal prosecutors introduced the high-definition data extraction from her own laptop. She was sentenced to 8 years in a maximum security federal correctional institution for aggravated wire fraud and identity theft. Xavier, having actively conspired to defraud a vulnerable senior citizen and willingly participating in the creation of the fraudulent shell company, received a harsh 6-year federal sentence. They will spend the rest of their youth locked inside concrete cells wearing cheap orange jumpsuits, completely stripped of the lavish lifestyle they so ruthlessly tried to steal. Their toxic marriage predictably imploded before the criminal trial even began. Both of them furiously tried to testify against the other, hoping to trade their spouse for a reduced sentence, but the prosecutors did not need their tainted testimonies. The digital paper trail I had meticulously gathered was already more than enough to bury them both. Cynthia's fate was arguably even more poetic and humiliating. She managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by completely liquidating every single asset she owned to pay massive state fines and provide full financial restitution to the clients she had brazenly embezzled from. However, her real estate broker's license was permanently revoked across all 50 states. The wealthy, arrogant woman who used to look down on my quiet career from the balcony of her exclusive country club is now completely bankrupt. She currently lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city, struggling to afford basic utilities. To pay off her mountain of remaining legal debts, she was forced to take a minimum wage job as a cashier at a local discount grocery store. Every single day, she stands on her feet for 9 grueling hours, wearing a polyester uniform, scanning cheap canned goods and bagging groceries for the very same working-class people she used to openly despise. She is a hollow ghost of her former self, trapped in a relentless cycle of menial labor and profound, crushing regret. I do not feel sorry for any of them. They engineered their own destruction with spectacular precision. I simply stepped aside, provided the necessary rope, and allowed their bottomless greed to drag them all down into the abyss. With the venomous infection completely removed from my life, I focused entirely on rebuilding my world on a solid foundation of absolute truth. The immediate cash sale of the sprawling suburban house provided me with an immense pool of liquid capital. I used a portion of those funds to completely furnish my new luxury penthouse in the heart of the city, surrounding myself only with things that bring me genuine peace and comfort. I no longer have to pretend to be a frail, confused old man hiding in the shadows of my own home. I wake up every morning with a sharp mind, an unburdened soul, and absolute financial freedom. But the greatest victory of all lies 300 miles away in the rural countryside of Georgia. Howard Kaplan successfully finalized the complex restructuring of my grandfather's irrevocable trust. The massive 300-acre property was never sold to the greedy commercial developers. Instead, it was officially transformed into the permanent headquarters for a newly established, fully funded agricultural and educational endowment. The foundation now provides comprehensive full-ride college scholarships to brilliant, underprivileged African-American students who lack the financial resources to escape their systemic circumstances. My grandfather bought that land with calloused hands and a broken back to secure a future for his bloodline. Since my direct bloodline chose the path of treachery, deceit, and self-destruction, I ensured his immense legacy would actively uplift the broader community instead. Every single time a young student graduates with a degree funded by that trust, the memory of my family's betrayal is further erased. It is replaced by a lasting monument of hope, education, and genuine opportunity. I took the ultimate weapon my family tried to use to destroy me, and I forged it into an unstoppable engine of generational wealth for those who truly deserve it. I am sitting on the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse apartment right now. The vibrant city lights of Atlanta stretch out infinitely below me, a glittering ocean of ambition and relentless energy. I hold a heavy crystal glass of vintage bourbon in my hand, listening to the smooth, comforting rhythm of jazz drifting from the high-end speakers inside. I am Carlton, 70 years old, completely alone and happier than I have ever been in my entire life. I learned the hardest way possible that true family is not defined by shared DNA or 40 years of forced proximity. It is defined by unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and basic human decency. When those crucial elements vanish, you must have the courage to sever the ties no matter how deeply they are rooted in your past. Never let anyone convince you that your age makes you weak or that your silence is a sign of submission. Sometimes the most devastating counterattack is simply letting your enemies talk themselves into a federal prison. I took a slow sip of the warm bourbon, smiling at the beautiful quiet night. The silent adjustment is officially complete. I also learned that the most dangerous weapon a person can possess is absolute emotional control. When someone attacks you, their greatest advantage is your predictable reaction. They desperately want your anger, or they expect your panic. But when you offer them nothing but complete silence, you force them to navigate blindly through their own suffocating arrogance. Age is never a vulnerability, but rather a profound strategic advantage built on decades of observing human nature. I survived because I completely refused to play the helpless victim in their chaotic drama. Instead, I became the silent architect of their absolute ruin, proving once and for all that cold patience will always outlast blind greed. If you have ever had to outsmart a toxic manipulator in your own life, share your victory in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of absolute justice.